Good morning, Excellencies, colleagues, dear friends. I'm pleased to welcome you to the virtual panel discussion organized by the Permanent Mission of Armenia to the UN, entitled From Emergency Relief to Multilateral Humanitarianism, the Legacy of the Near East Philanthropy in the Age of Genocide. Historically, international humanitarian cooperation evolved out of human experiences of crisis, calamities, and tragedies that necessitated collective action for relief and life-saving assistance. Today's event will look into the history of the development of multilateral humanitarian engagement and the ways that local and international actors are mobilized, particularly through the prism of the humanitarian legacy of Near East Foundation, one of the oldest international philanthropy organizations with programs in Middle East and Africa, which was initially formed in 1915 to address the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of the Armenian genocide. One of the darkest pages in the history of mankind in the 20th century, the systematic massacres of the Armenian population in Ottoman Empire in 1915 resulted in the extermination of 1.5 million Armenians who were killed or forcefully sent on death marches in Syrian desert, where most of them died of starvation and diseases. This campaign of deportation and mass killings of the Armenian population by the Ottoman authorities prompted the prominent Polish lawyer of Jewish descent, Raphael Lemkin, to coin the term genocide, paving way to the adoption of the Genocide Convention in 1948. It was precisely in the historical context of systematic killings of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire that the modern term crimes against humanity appeared, used officially for the first time by the Allied powers of France, Russia, and Great Britain in the joint declaration in May 1915, which represents the origin of the use of term as the label for the category of international crime. The report of the United Nations War Crimes Commission of 1948 not only contains details of the Armenian genocide, but also uses the events of 1915 as a historic example of categories of crimes against humanity and a precedent to the Nuremberg tribunals, and thereby as a precursor to the United Nations Genocide Convention. In 1985, the Subcommission on the Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights adopted a report on the question of the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide, which confirmed that systematic Ottoman massacres of Armenians meet the criteria of the United Nations definition of genocide and as one of the genocides of 20th century. As a strong supporter of the genocide prevention agenda, Armenia has a long-standing track record of international cooperation towards the prevention of atrocity crimes, which we are keen to sustain and take further. Over the past 5 years, the Aurora Prize for Awakening Humanity has been honored in Armenia with a $1 million prize established on behalf of the survivors of the Armenian genocide, awarded annually in recognition of the selfless work carried out by the exceptional humanitarians all over the world. Today, it is with great sadness and a feeling of most profound loss that I would like to pay tribute to a man whose service to humanity and humanitarianism was as extraordinary and unparalleled as was his life, his legacy, and his inspiration. Dr. Vartan Gregorian, the late president of Carnegie Corporation of New York and co-founder of the Aurora Humanitarian Initiative, was a true role model for the modern day humanitarians who were so much hoping, and we were so much hoping to be joined by him today at this conversation, but who passed away on April 15. A man who has accomplished so much, also having served as president of the New York Public Library, widely credited with restoring the status of the library as cultural landmark. Dr. Gregorian was awarded with the National Humanities Medal in 1998, and Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2004, the highest civil award of the United States. In whatever he did, Dr. Vartan Grigoryan stood out as an outstanding leader, scholar, educator, and intellectual who inspired generations of professionals by his visionary spirit. He'll be greatly missed, and of course, for the Armenian mission, today's event could not be anything but our own modest tribute to this exceptional humanitarian, Dr. Vartan Grigoryan. Dear friends, April 24 is the day when the world commemorates the victims of the systematic massacre that took lives of millions of Armenians, and also Greeks and Christian Assyrians in Ottoman Turkey. It has been said so many times before that the international community failed to prevent the Armenian genocide largely due to the lack of preventive mechanisms and the crisis of international order at the time. 100 years on, however, the ability of the international community to properly identify and react to humanitarian crises is still being considerably challenged. Only recently, Azerbaijan and Turkey unleashed brutal, senseless violence against the Armenian people amidst the global pandemic in an attempt to resolve Nagorno-Karabakh conflict by force with the involvement of foreign terrorist fighters and mercenaries, accompanied by numerous extensively documented war crimes. Azerbaijan's denial of humanitarian access of the international community to the conflict-affected population of Nagorno-Karabakh following its recent aggression, failure to release the numerous prisoners of war and civilian hostages who are still being held in captivity, contrary to the international humanitarian law, as well as the widespread state-led campaign of dehumanization of Armenians, such as, for example, the recently opened military trophy park, which has already been named as National Hatred Theme Park by international media, come to manifest that the genocidal ideology does not merely belong to history. This is a source of grave concern that needs to be properly identified and acknowledged to prevent further atrocities. Dear colleagues, friends, the Armenian genocide and the surrounding events built a historical context which was unique in a number of ways. Not only did it shape the origin of the use of term crimes against humanity as the label for a category of international crime, but it also paved the way to the first ever major international humanitarian relief operation in the world. Many diplomats, missionaries, and relief workers who witnessed the horrors of the crimes perpetrated against the Armenian population responded to a call for action and mobilized the largest international humanitarian movement with the support of the US government and fundraising efforts. Initially known as the Armenian Committee for Syrian and Armenian Relief and later as Near East Relief, this humanitarian initiative saved more than 130,000 Armenian orphans and over 1 million refugees, established over 400 refugee processing centers, hospitals, vocational schools, and orphanages. Expanding its vision of aid from emergency survival to creating a full round of life, helped Near East Relief transform itself from a wartime humanitarian aid society into a professional development agency, currently known as Near East Foundation. It has pioneered many of the strategies currently employed by the world's leading humanitarian and development organizations. Today, we are also paying tribute to this outstanding effort, initially established with the support of the American people to help alleviate the sufferings of the Armenians. The recognition and reaffirmation of the fact of the Armenian genocide by the US administration on the 106th anniversary 2 days ago was not only an important tribute to the victims of the Armenian genocide and to their families, but a remarkable contribution to the fight against denialism and attempts to whitewash past crimes for which we are very grateful for. With this, I have the honor to introduce the panelists of today's event, distinguished academics and practitioners of humanitarian multilateralism. Dr. Hachik Muradyan, who is lecturer in Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University, and whose recent book on the Armenian genocide and humanitarianism in Ottoman Syria uncovers the history of an underground network of humanitarians, missionaries, and diplomats who helped save lives of thousands during the genocide. We have Ms. Savita Pandey, Deputy Executive Director of the Global Center of Responsibility to Protect. We're happy to join by Ms. Tali Nates, who joins us from South Africa, is the Executive Director of Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. And we're very happy that Dr. Hugo Slim, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Ethics, Law, and Armed Conflict of Blavatnik School of Government of Oxford University, will be sharing his views during the discussion. And I'm very grateful to Ms. Sarah Lee Whitson, the Executive Director of Democracy for Arab World Now, former Executive Director of Human Rights Watch Middle East, who will moderate today's discussion. Thank you to all the participants of today's event. The event is being broadcast on UN Web TV and will be available for viewing later on. I will now pass the floor to the moderator who will take this important conversation forward. Please, Ms. Whitson.
Good day, everyone, and thank you for the Armenian Mission for organizing this and allowing us all to benefit from the thoughts and insights of a really amazing panel of speakers who I think all will be bringing a very unique and important perspective on the issue of humanitarianism during genocide. And there's so much gratitude there for the work of humanitarians that in the darkest of times, in the worst of humanity, they also show us the best of humanity. And our debt to humanitarian leaders is one that we very happily take on because their work is so important. I must also express my gratitude for President Biden's formal recognition of the Armenian genocide this Saturday on the 106th anniversary of the genocide. And while I must admit that it's very painful and even embarrassing for the Armenian diaspora community to have been begging for this recognition for so long, there is a wound in that as well. I am very grateful that he's finally taken this step, and I hope that we have finally taken the issue of genocide recognition off of the political table. And I know that our speakers are going to be touching on this in their remarks. I think our first speaker, if I've got the order right, is Hachik Muradyan, my dear friend, a brilliant academic, a great scholar, and really a thought leader in the field of genocide and humanitarianism, far beyond the experience of the Armenian genocide. Hachik, can I pass the mic to you? And really looking forward to hearing about your book as well.
Thank you, Sarah Lee. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. It's a great pleasure for me to be here and part of this distinguished panel. I know what my remarks are, so I really look forward to hearing the rest of the remarks. So my portion is the least interesting, at least for me. I'd like to, in the 10 minutes allotted to me, say a few words about humanitarianism as it pertains to the Armenian experience during World War I, and reflect on some of its implications on today. So when President Joe Biden issued his Armenian Remembrance Day statement over the weekend acknowledging the Armenian genocide, my thoughts traveled to Deir ez-Zor, Syria. In the summer of 1916, this town on the fringes of a crumbling empire became a synonym for the deportation, dispossession, and destruction of the Armenians. Away from the eyes of the world, the sands of Deir ez-Zor crystallized the affliction of a nation, and generations of Armenians adopted the town as a synonym for the indescribable. Around 200,000 Armenians were massacred in Deir ez-Zor alone during the genocide. The total count, as the ambassador mentioned, is close to 1.5 million. But I argue that the Armenians, even in the darkest corners of the genocide, in the darkest of times, in the words of Sarah Lee Whitson, organized a robust self-help effort that for too long has been sidelined in the historiography and public discourse on the Armenian genocide and humanitarianism during that period. Typically, the way the scholarship and the discourse is framed, and I challenge this in my work, is there's this implicit depiction of Armenians as passive recipients of violence on the one hand, and Western humanitarianism on the other. So the scholarship and the public discourse largely define perpetrators and Western humanitarians, but not the targeted group, as actors, focusing on how the former killed, the Ottoman Turkish authorities, and the latter saved. Yet our understanding of the dynamics of mass violence would be flawed without fully integrating the targeted group's responses into the narrative. Although the genocidal machine aims to maximize the very power asymmetry that propels it, it cannot erase the opposition of the victims as individuals and as a group. So what I do in my work is I zoom in on one region of the Ottoman Empire, in fact, the deadliest during World War I. And I demonstrate how Armenians coordinated a robust humanitarian resistance effort, and therefore they were an integral part of the humanitarian work that was being done in the region. So as Armenians were being systematically removed from their ancestral homes, a humanitarian effort to rescue the starving Armenians, quote unquote, was launched across the Atlantic in the United States. The Armenian Relief Committee, ARC, was formed in September 1915. This is the organization that will have different names over the years, and the ambassador talked about Near East Relief, Near East Foundation, as today the torchbearers of that legacy. So this was established in September 1915. I show in my work that, in fact, Armenian humanitarian work in this context and relief work had started immediately after the deportations in May of 1916. So a few months later, there's this major infusion of resources into the effort. The Armenian Relief Committee cables, for example, $100,000 to the US ambassador in Istanbul within a month of its establishment in October 1915. And by the end of 1915, the committee had raised $176,929. This work would continue. Similar funds will continue to be raised into the 1920s, amounting to a couple $2 billion in today's money. The distribution of relief funds was entrusted to a committee of prominent Americans in Istanbul, headed by the ambassador, Henry Morgenthau. US diplomats received pushback from the Ottoman authorities as they tried to dispense money to the deportees in Istanbul, Aleppo, and other areas. The ministers of war and foreign affairs objected to Americans distributing relief to Armenians because assistance by foreigners would encourage such idealists as the Armenians to further resist against the government. And I'm quoting here. So the ministers proposed the transfer of American funds to government accounts, Ottoman Turkish government accounts, with relief administered by the authorities. So ironically, you have the very same authorities that are orchestrating the dispossession and destruction of the Armenian population, demanding that the United States essentially relinquish these funds to them in order for them to disperse these funds. So the ministers proposed the transfer of American funds to government accounts with relief administered by the authorities. Morgenthau, the ambassador, U.S. ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, refused, citing the wishes of American donors that the funds be administered by none other than the U.S. ambassador. Now, around the same time, the United States is engaging a number of efforts, sending commissions in order to ascertain the circumstances on the ground. Much of this is refused by the authorities, and ultimately, this effort, as I mentioned earlier, will raise a tremendous amount of funds, particularly in the United States, through the participation of schools, institutions, individuals, families, and the U.S. Congress, and it will be one of the bright spots of a dark history during World War I. Now, the scholarly literature on efforts to raise funds for Armenians and the humanitarian relief efforts of Western missionaries, by and large, depicts Armenians as passive recipients of humanitarian aid. Historians present a compelling narrative of the efforts to raise money in America. So this is very well documented. Scholars such as Susan Moranian, Peter Balakian, Keith Wattenpaugh have wonderful contributions to the scholarship in that front. Yet there is hardly any mention of how these funds reached the deportees during the genocide, 1915, 1916 in particular. Armenians distributed funds to tens of thousands of survivors, often covertly and under dangerous circumstances, with US consuls and Western missionaries serving as intermediaries. So it was Armenian committees, orphanage administrators, humanitarian resistors, people who are actually on the ground as a genocide is unfolding, engaging in this effort against the law and the will of the authorities, who do not want this kind of effort being done, right? And therefore risking their lives. So these important intermediaries, the Armenian activists and humanitarians, are crucial to the history. In his memoir, survivor John Minassian, for example, offers one way in which money reached Armenian Relief Network in Aleppo. And I quote him. He says, "I began delivering messages in folded envelopes to Mr. Jackson," this is the US consul in Aleppo, the American consul, "who when evening fell would send his secretary to visit Reverend Eskijian and leave him a small canvas bag," end of quote. Eskijian would in turn disperse the funds to Aleppo and send portions of his associates to in other areas for distribution. So Reverend Eskijian is one example of one of these intermediaries, a community leader in Aleppo. There are many others. In my work, I talk about numerous such individuals, Armenian men and women who are engaged in this effort, and some of whom we know very little about. In fact, one person, I only know his first name, and I know that on one of these forays into Deir Zor, he was actually killed. We know very little about the dreams, aspirations of these men and women, apart from the fact that they engage in this humanitarian effort and sacrifice their lives in the process. So what has happened is that over the past decades, there's been major efforts, hundreds of accounts, memoirs, monographs, and scholarly articles, books dedicated to Western humanitarians serving in the Ottoman Empire in numerous languages, right? Also, numerous events have been organized by Armenians, by survivors, their children and grandchildren around the world to honor these humanitarians. But the couriers, mostly Armenians, but also other Christians, Muslims, and Jewish people of the Ottoman Empire, who, at the risk of their lives and the cost of 1,000 sacrifices, to quote one Arab observer, have helped and relieved thousands of exiles starving in the deserts, have received little attention. And it's important here to really integrate that into the narrative because it has lessons for the here and now. The Armenian case demonstrates how much is suppressed from the narrative when the actions and the words of the targeted groups are relegated to the margins. Every time the accomplishments of human rights organizations and human rights NGOs are being touted, it is a helpful exercise to ask, what about the local activists and humanitarian workers? is their work being suppressed or erased from the narrative? And every time we read in the media about crimes and atrocities, it is worth asking, what about the agency of the victims? In what ways are they pushing back against these crimes? So the Armenian case challenges conventional thinking about mass violence, the target group's reaction to it, and intervention. It demonstrates the role community structures and key connectors can play when a group is under attack, and the importance of working with them, not putting them to work in devising and implementing any form of humanitarian action. Much of the aid work and human rights activism we witness around the world today, well-meaning as it may be, sometimes falls short in this regard. And as I conclude, I'd like to share this image from, I started in Deir ez-Zor in Syria. I wanted to return to Deir ez-Zor in Syria. I visited one of the mass graves in Deir ez-Zor from the Armenian genocide, right before the war in Syria broke. And this was in a little town called Bushehr, and the school had just been built. The school was supposed to be built on a site, and then as they were digging the area, they found, bones, and they discovered it was one of the mass graves in the region. There's a couple of dozen of such mass graves in the area. And the school was built right next to this mound, to this mass grave. But it served at that point as the playground for the children there. So as we were scratching the surface, I was there with a number of journalists from The Economist and other outlets. And as we were scratching the surface here and these bones are protruding, these kids playing there started bringing pieces of bones to us. And when we asked them, what are these? They would say, Armani, Armenians. I think about this photograph quite often. I've thought about this photograph quite often in the past several years as war was raging in Syria. And I've wondered what happened to these kids. Where they are, Deir ez-Zor itself has been for one of the flashpoints of the conflict and the war and misery and displacement and massacres. I've wondered where these kids are today, in what refugee camp, in which area, in which region. And I've shared this image before at other talks and events. And recently, I received a message from Syria on social media telling me that that boy with the white T-shirt in the front actually has died during the war. So in many ways, these layers of violence in Syria today are a reminder of the legacy of not just destruction and death and massacres, humanitarian intervention, but also of the stories of these individuals and the way in which they try to push back against all odds. And when we think about humanitarianism, and when we think about violence and mass violence and its aftermath, it's not just about thinking about prevention. It's not just about trying to bring perpetrators and holding them accountable, but it's also about how we engage in this humanitarian action. Whether we see ourselves, what kind of world we're going to inherit to these children is very much also conditional on how we see ourselves as individuals and groups and organizations are intervening. Do we see ourselves as people who are supposed to lead and others are supposed to, the locals are supposed to work for us and follow us as we engage in humanitarianism? Or do we see ourselves as individuals standing next to the locals and allowing them to chart their own future as we support them as much as possible? This very much will determine how we think about the future and what kind of future we inherit, as much as how we think about accountability and prevention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hachik, for those remarks, and I really look forward to reading the book. Could you remind us the title of that?
Yes, it's titled The Resistance Network, the Armenian Genocide and Humanitarianism in Ottoman Syria, 1915-1918.
The Resistance Network. That is a beautiful title. Our next speaker is Ms. Savita from one of the most important organizations that is active on issues of genocide today and active on issues of demanding a collective humanitarian response as a part of genocide prevention. And I'm very honored that we have responsibility to protect here with us, and eager to hear your reflections as well, Ms. Savita. Mike is yours.
Thank you very much, Sarah Lee. Good morning, colleagues, and thank you to the Permanent Mission of Armenia for organizing this event and for inviting me to be part of this discussion. I would like to begin by remembering the victims of past atrocities as we commemorate the 106th anniversary of the Armenian genocide. As you know, previous speakers have said that starting on April 24th, 1915, over 1.5 million Armenians living under the Ottoman Empire were targeted and killed during mass killings and mass deportation. In a historic move, on Saturday, US President Joe Biden formally recognized that the atrocities against the Armenian people constituted a genocide. While this acknowledgement is largely symbolic, a recognition of the crime of genocide can prevent its recurrence. Acknowledging that genocides and atrocities have been committed against a certain population is a first step towards securing justice for survivors and victims. It is also a first step towards acknowledging the patterns of structural discrimination that exist in a society that could then lead to genocide and commission of other atrocity crimes. So if we diagnose a problem correctly, then finding solutions to address it become easier. Whereas denial aggravates the injuries of the past and sows the seeds for future injustices. Acknowledging the truth and learning from the past is crucial to create a collective understanding of how the international community should uphold its responsibility to protect prosecuted populations today. So in solidarity with the Armenian people, the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect calls on all UN member states to officially recognize the Armenian genocide and end once and for all a century of indifference and denial, because only by learning from the past can we build a better future. But at an event like this, 106 years after such a terrible moment in the history of the Armenian people, we also need to assess our collective ability to end similar suffering today. Around the world, more than 80 million people are currently displaced by conflict, persecution, and atrocities. The vital work of humanitarian organization has never been more important. However, as Mr. Lowcock, the head of the UN Office for the Coordination for Humanitarian Affairs, said just last week, that humanitarian agencies can only ever respond to the symptoms of global crises. We can alleviate the suffering caused by the crises, but we cannot stop them from happening. And Mr. Lowcock is right, as we all know. We all know that today's humanitarian crises will not be solved by blankets and bandages alone. Conflict now drives 80% of all humanitarian needs. Therefore, humanitarian efforts aimed at emergency assistance for victims of conflict are no substitute for policies that are aimed at building long-term political solutions. Given that most of the large-scale humanitarian crises today have arisen from the situations of mass atrocity crimes being perpetrated, solutions to address the current crises lie in upholding political norms like the responsibility to protect. The rhetoric of prevention is prolific in the UN, but speeches do not prevent atrocities. Timely political action does. So here are some examples that will very starkly highlight the argument that I'm making. When Myanmar's military, the Tatmadaw, launched its so-called clearance operation in Rakhine State in August 2017 against the Rohingya populations, the international community's commitment to R2P was tested. During this time, the military committed crimes against humanity and war crimes in Rakhine State, as well as acts of genocide against the Rohingya population. The majority of the Rohingya population was forced to flee, risking their lives to cross over to Bangladesh. Because the humanitarian situation was so devastating, with such enormous needs, and with a deadlocked UN Security Council unable to respond to the crimes committed against the Rohingya, most states started characterizing the situation as a humanitarian crisis taking place in Bangladesh, rather than viewing the crisis as an act of genocide perpetrated by the Tatmadaw. The conflict in Yemen is another shocking example. The conflict has displaced over 4 million people and created the world's largest humanitarian crisis. The dire humanitarian situation is a direct result of the way in which the conflict has been conducted. For years, civilians in Yemen have suffered from war crimes and crimes against humanity as the parties to the conflict, including the Saudi coalition and the Houthis, perpetrate indiscriminate attacks, target civilian infrastructure, and systematically block humanitarian aid. And sadly, the civilians will continue to bear the brunt of hostilities until the international community recognizes that the solutions to the humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen is not just more aid, but more global political pressure on those who are waging this destructive war, those who are arming them, and those who protect their interests at the UN. In Ethiopia's Tigray region, there have also been widespread reports of crimes, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing since the armed hostilities broke out between the regional authorities and the federal government in late November. Amidst the ongoing conflict, the humanitarian situation has deteriorated. The majority of Tigray is inaccessible to aid agencies, and more than 5 million people are in need of assistance. For months, neither the African Union nor the UN Security Council has made any substantial progress towards mediating an end to the conflict or holding the perpetrators accountable. Despite the unfolding tragedy in Tigray, when the UN Security Council discussed the situation in Ethiopia during March, it was in the context of the debate on humanitarian assistance and food. Now, 6 months into the war, the UN Security Council finally issued a press statement on the situation on 22nd April, just last week, which again focuses primarily on the dire humanitarian situation in Tigray. And while the humanitarian needs are immense, the crisis cannot be solved with humanitarian solutions. This will require political action, a political situation, and legal accountability. As these three examples make clear, all too often in the world today, discussions on humanitarian needs and funding of humanitarian appeals have become an excuse for political inaction. Instead of taking bold steps to mediate the stop of the violence or to hold perpetrators of atrocities responsible for their actions, the UN Security Council, the UN Secretariat, the UN bodies, and relevant stakeholders often focus on humanitarian issues. In the multilateral sphere, viewing a crisis through a humanitarian lens is also seen as being apolitical and neutral, as a way to build consensus or secure access to a region or a regime. Yet, in reality on the ground, the delivery of humanitarian aid remains deeply political. I would go so far as to say that international community has become complicit in giving some perpetrators a free pass. In order to maintain consensus and an illusion of access, crises get characterized or diagnosed as humanitarian in nature, and as a result, the real issues at stake are conveniently overlooked. So, for example, the failure of the UN Security Council to adequately respond to the 2017 genocide against the Rohingya in Myanmar has created a climate of impunity that the generals exploited. The February 1st coup is the price that the people of Myanmar are going to be paying for a very long time for the international community's failure to uphold human rights and to hold these generals accountable. I ask you, seriously, until, how long does it take? How long it will be since we will be discussing the developing crisis in Myanmar currently as a humanitarian situation. So as we commemorate the 106th anniversary of the beginning of the Armenian genocide, it is right that we acknowledge the extraordinary humanitarian efforts undertaken by Armenians themselves, as the professor told us before, and by Americans who supported Near East relief and saved countless Armenian lives during and after the genocide. This was humanitarianism at its greatest, driven by ordinary people, relying on human solidarity with people in a faraway land. But a century later, what have we learned? Now more than ever, the world needs to consistently uphold its responsibility to protect and work to prevent atrocities wherever and whenever they occur. The anniversary of the Armenian genocide serves as a reminder from history that indifference and inaction should never be acceptable response to genocide. The most fitting memorial to the victims and survivors of the Armenian genocide is that we end once and for all the systems of persecution, discrimination, and hate that are the precursors of genocide, and that we build institutions, organizations, and societies that place human rights and humanitarianism at the core of our value system. That is the real lesson from 1915, and sadly, it is a lesson that we still often ignore. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Savita, for connecting us to some of the current day atrocities and the responsibility of the international community and its complicity in mischaracterizing political crises as humanitarian ones. That is a dodge that we unfortunately see too often, but I don't think we take enough responsibility for the harm that causes. Our next speaker is Ms. Tali Nates from the center in South Africa, where they are actively engaged in memory and commemoration and really understanding how education about genocides is part of prevention. She's also going to talk to us about the important role of recognition and the function that it serves for all of us. Tali?
Thank you so much, Sarah Lee, and thank you, Ambassador, so much for inviting me. It's wonderful to be with all the friends and newer friends on the same panel. It is an honor to addressing you today. As a practitioner in the field of Holocaust and genocide remembrance and education, and as the founder of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center that I want to invite you now to visit, only online sadly, but let me share my screen that you can at least see where I'm coming to you from. Welcome to the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, which was founded 12 years ago and is in association with similar centers in Durban and Cape Town under the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation. The focus of my short contribution will be on the importance of genocide remembrance, of education, and the essential role of partnerships for civil society, for grassroots to get to, from bottom up, to get to governments. And that includes museums, it includes memorials, and of course, education institutions and systems. And that is essential, I argue, for humanitarian feeling and execution to actually happen. So I want to take you into the issue of recognition. And thank you very much to our partners, the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, that created this very impactful photograph that was on social media on the weekend, on Saturday, at the 106th anniversary of the genocide in Rwanda. As increasing numbers of countries, including Germany, including France, and just this weekend, the USA, recognize the mass murder of Christian Armenians between 1915 and 1923 as genocide. And more important, understanding that the word genocide indeed was only coined in 1944 by Polish-Jewish lawyer Raphael Lemkin and adopted to a convention by the newly formed UN in December 1948, but indeed acknowledging that word, acknowledging that crime, of the traumatic and painful memory of survivors and their descendants, and also of communal or community trauma, national trauma of the entire nation is of utmost importance. It is important to the victims, to their families, but to all humanity, that there is a wider recognition of this painful chapter in history. Professor Gregory Stanton, and I'm entering the exhibition about Armenia in our exhibition, but want to include the words of Professor Gregory Stanton of Genocide Watch, that is offering us a useful tool to recognize the warning signs of genocide. He calls it the 10 stages of genocide. And you can take some of it or all of it, but it is a useful tool. He suggests that genocide's last stage is always denial, and that all genocides, including the Holocaust, including the genocide that targeted the Tutsi in Rwanda, sadly suffer from this 10th stage, that of denial, but I would like to add of also distortion. Distortion in numbers, distortion in facts, just distortion of that history. And it is so important that that memory will be educated about, will be spoken about, not only in museums and memorials, but also at schools and at universities. Our center in Johannesburg, from its start, made the decision to include genocides in the 20th century and include the Armenian genocide in its exhibitions, in its education programs, to youth, to the public, and to commemorate the Armenian genocide annually. Our non-linear thematic permanent exhibition covers a number of interlinking themes, starting from actually next door to us, Namibia, with the Herero and Nama genocide of 1904, continuing with Armenia and the 1915 to 1923 genocide. We do look at the story of Raphael Lemkin that I mentioned before, and the coining of the word and the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the crime against the crime of genocide. We also look at crimes against humanity in South Africa, because we are a country that are confronting indeed our painful past. We look at the Holocaust, we look at the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, and we reflect on connections between all that, connections between the past and between current challenges South Africa is facing, may it be racism or xenophobia or other issues. So connections are really important, and quick connections. We do not need to wait 106 years to make those connections. The connections, like Primo Levi said, must be about, if it happened before, it can happen again. And we need to act faster. We need to be constant in our acting. Our center and centers in South Africa promote active citizenship. And we utilize the arts. And that is, I think, important, and we didn't speak about it yet today. So by using the arts, music, art, poetry, writing, you try to keep the spaces full of life rather than only full of past death. So in 2020, for example, during the pandemic lockdown, the severe lockdown, we couldn't hold an in-center commemoration for the genocide, the Armenian genocide. So what we did was to invite for an educational intervention our own Philharmonic Orchestra's first violin and concert master, Muradyan to perform the Komitas Krunk, the crane, in our exhibition spaces. I want us to listen just for a few seconds of that performance, just to connect us to the art, to connect us to the emotion. By the way, you can listen to that full performance on the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center's YouTube channel. And I'm really sorry to stop here. I wish I could play the whole thing, but time does not permit me to do so. A crucial theme of reflective thinking presents in our mission, exhibition, and education programs. And that is something that I want us all to reflect on. The theme is choices and dilemmas. Because through this theme, through the stories of and testimonies of individuals, of communities, and of governments, we need to connect to the choices made during genocide, indeed during all genocides. For example, that of Henry Morgenthau that we spoke about just earlier, and the many other self-help and other help that we spoke about. We also need to look at the consequences of those choices. This theme is important and is discussed in all education programs that we conduct in our centers. It encourages the youth to understand the moral dilemmas and complexities of responding to genocide. The emphasis is on the role of bystanding and the role of upstanding, that is the opposite of bystanding, acting, and encouraging activist behavior. And in fact, I call on memorials and museums to use memory activism to encourage and develop youth care, youth involvement. It is critical to develop local and international partnerships. From the start, that was really essential in our view when we established our center. For example, our lighting guru, the closest partner we had to create this beautiful center that I showed you before, is the brilliant Paul Pambukian. His late mother, Rose, that you see in this picture, lit a candle and gave her testimony about her family who survived the Armenian genocide at the 100th commemoration event in 2015. With our partners, the Armenian Youth of South Africa and its founder that you see in this photo, David Abramyan, We hold annual commemorations and other events. We just held ours on Thursday night. And these include film screenings and lectures. And this is possible thanks to an international partnership with ARPA, International Film Festival. We screen films such as My Grandmother's Tattoo, connecting again to those deserts and those bones that we spoke about before. We screened The Promise and Crows of the Desert, and many more. We also hosted lectures and educational activities. And international cooperation is of utmost importance with the International Association of Genocide Scholars, IAGS, and the American University of Armenia, as well as the Armenian Genocide Museum in Yerevan. So as I close, and you see a gathering of Armenian descendants from the community in Johannesburg gathering in one of our events, I want to encourage museums and memorials around the world, as well as civil society and educational institutions, to strengthen, develop, and form new local and global partnerships to support and develop education, memory, and lessons for humanity. Learning from the genocide of the Armenians can help us all to confront our own difficult and painful history, and hopefully turn the words "never again" from a question mark to a reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Tali, and the very moving music that you shared with us from Gomidas. That means a lot to me personally, I must say. So I'm very thankful for that. And again, the notion that we can have beauty and art growing out of suffering is such an important affirmation of our humanity. Next, we have with us Hugo Slim from Oxford University, who is going to talk about the progress of humanitarian multilateralism, touching on, I think, some of the themes that we heard from Hachik on a focus on Western humanitarianism and multilateralism, but also talking about the precedents of humanitarian resistance. With that, I will turn it over to Mr. Slim.
Sarah, thank you very much indeed. And Ambassador, thank you too. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with the Armenian mission at this time of remembrance, and to try and review 106 years of humanitarian multilateralism. And as Hachik said, a truly international system of humanitarian aid and protection began in World War I. Obviously in the Near East around the Armenian catastrophe and genocide, but also over in Europe, in Belgium, with the great Herbert Hoover, leading an enormous operation there too. Tragically for the Armenians, this emerging system, this very embryonic system really at that time, was too underdeveloped and too insufficient to prevent the Armenian genocide. But the norms, practices, organizations, and ambitions from that time have grown from that tragedy. So I want to try and do two things in the next few minutes. First, to review the progress and failure since 1915, and look at how humanitarian multilateralism sees and responds to atrocity and war today. And secondly, I want to look at the international humanitarian system that we have today and see how it needs to change. It still needs to change. And I'm going to argue that it's still too Western and too colonial, slightly in the spirit of Hachik's talk. So first, if we look between 1915 and 2021, these are 106 years. First, of course, we are struck by massive failures that have continued after the Armenian genocide, After that, we had Japanese atrocities against the Chinese, and in Southeast Asia, we had the Jewish Holocaust. We had extraordinary saturation bombing of German and Japanese people by the US and British aerial forces. We had devastating partitions, India, Pakistan, Israel, Palestine. We've had continuing and other genocides, of course, in Bangladesh, Biafra, Cambodia, Rwanda. And we've had extraordinary violence and ethnic cleansing and what might have become genocide in Darfur. And of course, today, Syria, Yemen, and of course, the deeply troubling conditions of Muslim minorities in Myanmar and China. But despite these, and while these catastrophes have been going on, the multilateral system has developed and responded. And we've seen an extraordinary increase in international humanitarian law, in human rights law. So the legal framework has developed and thickened. We've seen in the last 20, 30 years in particular, extraordinary new energy and responsibility being taken at the UN, where you all are, by the UN General Assembly through ECOSOC, which has taken a big stake in shaping humanitarian multilateral policy, and the United Nations Security Council, which has really in the last 20, 30 years made the protection of civilians a major issue in the maintenance of international peace and security. And during that time, we've also seen an extraordinary increase in financial investment into humanitarian multilateralism. So if we think back to the beginning of this century, the year 2000, the annual humanitarian budget was about $6.7 billion. And earlier this year, the UN made an appeal for $35 billion, hoping to reach 235 million people. And we can look around the world and see formally employed in humanitarian agencies about 570,000 humanitarian workers in the big UN, INGO, Red Cross, Red Crescent agencies. At the same time, we've seen an extraordinary elaboration of what constitutes humanitarian aid. So from the orphanages, food, medicine of the Armenian Committee and the Near East Foundation, and at that time, we're now seeing a system that is really trying to focus almost on sort of high-end welfareism as a global safety net. So we're looking at health systems, food systems, livelihood, social protection, education, and elaborate humanitarian diplomacy. And in that time, and it's so interesting if you read Hachik's book, which you must, the role of cash was just unassumed there. It was the only way for people to move stuff around clandestinely and give power to people in that moment. And of course, we've had a cash revolution in humanitarian multilateralism in the last few years as well, and so much more. I mean, billions now is transferred as cash, as it was in Hachik's resistance network. I just want to take a moment to in a way, tragically compare Syria 1916 with Syria 2016. And in 1916, of course, Armenians were murdered, forcibly displaced, destituted into the Syrian death marches, which Hachik described, starved, dying of typhus, and massacred. And millions died. And in 2016, war has been all over Syria again. And again, civilian populations in Syria have been bombed, indiscriminately attacked, besieged for long periods, starved, forcibly displaced, and massacred. But this time, there were no horrendous death marches. And there was this international humanitarian multilateral system that could catch people in some kind of basic safety net, either as IDPs or as refugees crossing borders. So that although many have died, more than half of Syria is now destitute, displaced, millions have survived. And this is because of the humanitarian multilateral system and because of aid. And in that process of protection, it's important to notice the multilateral system, but also the extraordinary contribution of Turkey. and the Turkish Red Crescent, who have in fact invested enormous amounts of money in a humanitarian response on their border for refugees. I want to give one example because I was moved that Hachik talked of Deir ez-Zor, that town which was the sort of end point of hell, I think he called it in his book, in 1916 for Armenians. It has been at the center of the Syrian conflict. It's been under siege for years between 2014 and 2017. But extraordinarily, it was not abandoned, it was not cut off, and the World Food Programme ran an aerial food distribution system of airdrops for 18 months, 309 airdrops, which gave food to 100,000 people in Deir ez-Zor. And I wish that that same system of multilateralism had been able to reach the Armenians at Deir ez-Zor. And it's a terrible and tragic thing that it didn't. But people in that place again have been reached by humanitarian multilateralism, which exists today and saves lives. And the second thing I want to talk about there is, should we be happy with this international system that we have in 2021? And I'm going to suggest, no, we've got to change it. Is it really a fully multilateral system? No, it's not. It's essentially a Western system, a Western club system, really, financed almost entirely by OECD countries. And it is driven really in New York and in other places, Geneva, by WEOG, by the Western group amongst you all. And it is operated colonially in some ways by a big group of big agencies who dominate the spend, dominate the resources, dominate the policy, and who do, if we're honest, function as a sort of imperial elite upon a subject people in many ways around the world, who NGOs, local NGOs, governments even become contractors to this rather imperial system. So what are we going to do? We need to change this in the next 5 years, and you need to change it from New York, from the UN, as well as from the ground up. And COVID is a huge testing point for this, because COVID's a big moment for humanitarian multilateralism to really work, but we're seeing it cracking already. But in fact, this is an opportunity for humanitarian multilateralism through a global vaccination campaign to really develop an international national structure that connects right from all states investing through to the last mile. And it's really important to do that because we need to diversify the states involved in humanitarian multilateralism. It cannot continue to be just a Western club. We need to know from China what they plan. We need to know what this extraordinary, fantastic civilization of China wants to do with humanitarian multilateralism. We need to hear what it plans to do, how it will support humanitarian multilateralism down the Belt and Road and all around the world. We need to hear the same from India, who more than any other country has phenomenal expertise and experience in disaster risk reduction, climate adaptation, all forms of poverty reduction. And ASEAN as well. And ASEAN has been leading very strongly lately and has managed to say we will work without a Western colonial tradition, and we need more of that. From the AU as well and from Latin America. And the second thing we need to do, other than broadening the base of humanitarian multilateralism, we need to, as Hachik cases has explained, we need to decenter the international agency in humanitarian multilateralism and drive and support much bigger locally led humanitarian response by local organizations, by governments, by civil society, by all sorts of people, because we are going to need a big humanitarian system across the world with all states involved at all levels. And that is for two enormous reasons. And the two huge reasons why we really have to change, develop, deepen, and broaden humanitarian multilateralism today in 2021 is to get ready for the climate crisis, which is inevitable and already arriving. We need a deeper, broader system for the climate crisis. And because with great powers and great empires, if you like, in play again today, as they were in 1915, we run the risk today again of big war, of massive global war. Hopefully, those powers will keep conflict managed, sub-threshold, and contained. But if they don't, then we're going to need a really big, deep humanitarian system across the world with everyone and all states involved. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Hugo. I'm busy sharing your remarks on social media, and therefore my video has been stuck. I think this concludes our presentations from the speakers, and I know that we want to open it up to questions from participants in the audience, and I know that the ambassador also wanted to make some comments before we do that. Ambassador?
Well, thank you. Thank you to all the speakers. It has been really interesting and impressive discussion, I should say. We have the format of the meeting now allows us to gather several questions, and they will appear in the chat box. And at this stage, if there are now, then the moderator, certainly you can guide accordingly. And I will ask you to pass the floor to me just to conclude at the end of the meeting. Thank you.
I don't see any questions in the chat box, but maybe they are going to appear shortly. Well, while we wait for that, let me just follow up with Hugo for some questions for some of the comments that he made. One is you're noting that the Western agencies and the Western states are the ones who control the resources and basically control the policies and priorities of humanitarian assistance. But isn't that where all the money is coming from? And how can we make states like China and India step up to a ratioed contribution? Is that a fair demand to make of them, given the tremendous needs in their own countries for their own populations? Is there a way to share power if the resources are all coming from one place?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So I don't think it's our business to make China or India do anything, actually. I think what I'm trying to say is, and you're right, all the majority of resources do come from the Western OECD governments at the moment, and that's to their credit. I mean, they have established a phenomenal response capacity, but it needs to change. And we need to understand as a global community how China will operate humanitarian support in the climate crisis, and how India will do it, and how they will help in their spheres of influence. They don't have to join the same club and the same approach as the Western powers, but they've got a great tradition of South-South aid, of working and understanding from inside countries, not having to sort of arrive and invade them like the West does a bit. So we need that clearer, and we need to understand what will be happening over in parts of Asia, and Latin America, because this little Western club can't just go on pretending it can do it all. So we need, if not one system, then good complementary systems that have climate crisis and others and COVID vaccination covered.
Mm-hmm. And I guess a question for Savita as well as you, Hugo, and I wonder whether you could reflect on, and also I guess Hachik, on what, at least to an outside observer like myself, appears to be a massive debate about the politicization of humanitarian aid and the way in which it's used in a highly politicized way, such that humanitarian assistance to Syria and how it's going to be distributed across borders that the government doesn't control becomes a completely political issue. How, when the American military is involved in humanitarian aid in Afghanistan, it leads to things like the targeting and killing of humanitarian workers trying to vaccinate for polio. You know, is this are there ways to deal with what is the instrumentalization of humanitarian assistance, but also the rejection of humanitarian assistance on claims that it is politicized?
I mean, I can begin, and then I'm sure Dr. Slim has way more than what I have to say to add to my response. But I think that there's an and coming at it from a human rights organization perspective, is that I think that the assumption that humanitarian aid is apolitical is problematic to begin with. I think that we have to think about it in that context, because, you know, as Dr. Sim talked about, like, who is giving humanitarian aid, who is controlling how it is coming, what kind of baggage attached to it. So I think that it has always been, and it'll always will be, something which is political. I mean, politics is all about fighting over resources. Humanitarian aid is a resource. So who gets it? How do they get it? You know, that's always political. And I mean, and yeah, we have seen that happening in Syria to a great extent. But again, I mean, going back to the point that I was trying to make in my presentation, I mean, you know, so much attention has been just focused. I mean, I know that, I mean, and they have done a fantastic job in terms of a lot of elected members who've had that Syria humanitarian file, who have done a tremendous job in trying to get the humanitarian across the border, across into Syria. But a lot of sort of political energies and political capital is spent on procuring and securing humanitarian aid, in debating how many, you know, corridors will be open and what path will be, and that sort of just subsumes all the energy. And then the energy which is required to actually think in terms of longer term solutions is just, you know, I mean, the same happened in Myanmar. That's exactly what we are seeing in Tigray. And I mean, you know, the fact is that a lot of the countries where atrocities are happening also use humanitarian aid access as leverage over making sure that there is not accountability and political action which targets them. So I'll stop there, but I mean, you know, I would just first of all question the assumption that humanitarianism or humanitarian aid itself is apolitical.
Hugo, do you want to add to that?
Not particularly. I mean, I think that's very well put. I think humanitarian aid is always perceived and seen politically, and sometimes it is. And, you know, not all humanitarian aid has to be neutral and independent. It's very important that governments take responsibility for it, who are part of fighting a conflict. And I think more and more in future, we're going to see social protection and sort of welfare systems coming into play. And those need to just be sort of provided really universally as much as possible. And I think the other point that comes out of Hachik's work so well is that there's an enormous place for investing in humanitarian resistance too, in certain atrocity-based crises. Certainly people should be encouraged to, you know, save the lives of their own community, resisting an oppressive force. And people should be ready to finance that kind of resistance support as well. So, you know, neutral, impartial, independent forms of humanitarian action is one very important way that the formal humanitarian system works. but there need to be other ways of support around social protection, particularly when we hit the climate crisis, which will be much more a question of poverty, rapid urbanization, destitution. We need to have wider systems. And countries like China and India are very good at those.
I see a question, and I think I should read the question. Is that appropriate, Ambassador? Is that a correct approach? Okay, so we have a question from Dr. Henry Thoreau, also a leading genocide scholar himself. And it's a question for Dr. Slim, and I will read it. You praise Turkey for its response to the Syrian crisis, yet hasn't Turkey been a major cause of violence in the region, as well as transporting thousands of jihadi mercenaries to commit violence in areas like Raqqa and attacking Armenians in this area with drones that have harmed civilians. So, and I think this question has broader implications, but what do relief efforts matter if the state is also a major force of violence, causing death and refugees? And of course, we see this so prominently in Yemen, and here I'm adding to Henry's question, where Saudi Arabia and UAE are bombarding Yemen to smithereens, but then bragging about the hundreds of millions of dollars they're giving the UN for humanitarian assistance in Yemen.
Yes, I want to share the question soon, but I have to answer Henry's one. Henry, exactly. I mean, of course, Turkey is a belligerent in several wars around the world, and that's not unusual. I mean, the big other humanitarian financiers and powerhouses, my government, the British, the Americans, other NATO forces are also belligerents in many of the wars that they also invest humanitarian aid in. Now, there's an important principle there, in a sense, almost, that if you are fighting a war, you have an extra responsibility to invest in humanitarian aid to mitigate the suffering of the war you are party to. But I think we're not going to avoid that, that particular challenge, or we'd only have aid from Norway and Switzerland, really, at the moment.
Sorry, I'm dealing with the technology here. I guess then, and maybe Savita, you have some reflections here. How do we deal with the ethical and political dilemma of states that provide humanitarian assistance while actively contributing to humanitarian crises? And again, the example of Yemen comes to mind because there's been so much money involved. But even in places like Israel, Palestine, where you have Israel routinely demolishing schools and houses in the West Bank, and then EU agencies rushing in to rebuild them, and it's it's farcical, this little cycle they're on, and at what point does the humanitarian assistance itself become part of the problem?
I mean, and I would totally agree with the point that you made, Sarah. I mean, which is such an important point, especially in the context of the Yemen crisis, that, here you have parties to the conflict. I mean, and the Saudi coalition is sort of, providing a huge amount, bragging about the humanitarian aid that they're providing, but at the same time committing crimes, in the conduct of the war. So, I think that the first thing to begin to say to the Saudi coalition is that, humanitarian aid is not going to have the same kind of effect if you're not even, upholding your IHL responsibilities. So, that's starkly the problem. And you're absolutely right. With the Israel Palestinian example that you gave, it is farcical. Even in Syria, that's what I feel sometimes, working as an advocate in the human rights space, that we're just putting bandages on problems. These are not long-term solutions. I mean, even in the case of Bangladesh, I mean, in September of 2017, when 700,000 Rohingya had crossed over to the border, the entire discourse within the UN with all member states was about humanitarian aid. I mean, there was not really a complete absence of the discussion that why are these people here? They're here because crimes have been committed against them. And I remember it was the Bangladesh mission to the UN who actually, in conversations with them, they said the same thing. They said that this is going to be a long-term humanitarian issue, which Bangladesh, an LDC at that time, but it's not anymore, has to deal with without any kind of sort of political discussion. And I remember we did this conversation at the UN. There was a lot of resistance from member states who were like, no, but we need to talk about the humanitarian crisis. Look how much we are sending. Look how much the OIC is sending and the humanitarian aid they are sending. So, I mean, this is a perpetual problem with the international system, and it's a perpetual cycle. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. I know we have to conclude at 11:30, but I want to circle back to Hachik, and I want to ask him a personal question, which, given his Armenian heritage and background, is probably particularly appropriate for the event that we're having today. Hachik, you've written this book, the Resistance Network, and obviously I think that reflects some of your personal upbringing and your personal thoughts. And, I just want to ask you what it is about your Armenian experience and Armenian background that led you to choose the field that you're in today and to write the book that you've written, and why it's important to you and why it's important to us.
Thank you for the question, Sarah Lee. There are perhaps two major humanitarian disasters and crimes that contributed to shaping my personality. One occurred 2 generations before I was born with the Armenian genocide. My grandparents on both sides are survivors and children of survivors. And the second occurred, I was born into, which was the Lebanese Civil War. So in many ways, these two experiences and the way in which the discourse, the global discourse around these cases have developed, and their shortcomings and problems have very much impacted the way I think about these issues. So in many ways, perhaps in fact, the Lebanese Civil War even more so, since I am a product, my school years were very much in that period during the war and its immediate aftermath. So in many ways, that has had a huge impact as well, and has been a reminder of the kind of long shadow that genocide and mass violence cast. The scattering of communities and the way in which these communities will end up in other places where conflict again will reach, and the way and a way of thinking about these groups, not just from the outside in and trying to intervene, but also trying to think about them and how they can transform their own environment with support from the outside. And I've seen that again, to repeat the point, in Lebanon, but also in Syria, in Yemen, that was brought up, and this is also very much has been an issue for me. So when I look at genocide, when I look at any kind of crime and mass violence, I don't just think about it as what the perpetrator is doing. I ask these questions about, as important for me is, how are the targeted groups trying to push back? And what are the best ways in which we can help them do that?
Thank you, Hachik, for that empowering message, and very much ties to the remarks of all of our speakers, including Dr. Hugo's reflections on agency and controlling the narrative and controlling the action. So that is really positive message to leave us on. I want to turn the mic back to the ambassador and also to thank him for putting so much time and effort into organizing this important panel and to allowing the Armenian mission to be at the center of a global conversation. That makes me personally feel very proud. So thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Sarah, very much for steering this important conversation. And I think that we had a very, very interesting and candid discussion, which leaves a lot of room to reflect on many important issues, from recognition to fighting denialism, and from humanitarian action to by the international organizations to the governments. And I can't thank you more for to be part also for this during this solemn occasion of the commemoration of the Armenian genocide, which we had on 24 April. And I want to thank also the UN colleagues who have connected and all the civil society organizations and Armenian diaspora community members. And we will continue pursuing the topic of the wider recognition of the Armenian genocide and fighting denialism in the UN and globally. Thank you all to all the panelists, and have a good day.